A boy walks out of a fish and chip shop in Cowes, on the Isle of Wight, England. It's just after midnight. He's 16. He's wearing blue jeans and a black fleece, and he's got a bag of chips in his hands. Steam still rising off them in the cold November air. The street is empty. The rain has just stopped. A CCTV camera above a shopfront catches him for a few seconds. Walking, alone, unhurried, chips in hand, and then he steps out of frame, into the dark at the end of the high street. That was the last confirmed sighting of Damien Nettles anyone has ever had. Not his mother, not his father, not the police, not the hundreds of people who have searched for him for almost 30 years. He didn't run away. He didn't get on a ferry. His bank account was never touched again. His passport was never used. He simply walked into the dark at the end of a street on a small island off the south coast of England, and the world closed over him like water. This is the story of what the Isle of Wight has spent almost 3 decades trying, and failing, to explain. This is the story of Damien Nettles. Before we get into it, if you're new here, this is AMC True Crime, and this is exactly the kind of case we exist for. Not the headline-grabbing cases that every channel has already covered 100 times, but the ones that slip through the cracks. The ones where a family has spent 30 years fighting just to be believed. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand why so many investigators, journalists, and armchair detectives call this one of the most frustrating unsolved cases in modern British history. And if you want to be here for the next deep dive into a case like this, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because we post cases like this every week. Now, let's go back to the beginning. To understand why this case still haunts an entire island, you have to understand who Damien Nettles actually was. Not the CCTV silhouette, not the missing person poster, but the person. Damien Richard Nettles was born on the 21st of June, 1980, to Valerie and Edward Nettles. He had a younger sister and a younger brother, James. The family lived in Gurnard, a quiet coastal village just outside Cowes, on the Isle of Wight, a small island off the south coast of England, separated from the mainland by the Solent, best known to most outsiders for its yachting regattas and its music festival. To the people who actually lived there, it was something smaller and more ordinary, a tight-knit community where everybody knew everybody, where nothing much happened, and where a missing teenager was almost unthinkable. By 16, Damien had grown into a striking young man, 6'4", gangly the way tall teenagers often are, still growing into his own height. He loved music. He was a huge fan of Nirvana, the kind of fan who wore the t-shirts and knew the lyrics. And like a lot of British teenagers in the mid-90s, he wore a pair of Doc Martens boots almost everywhere he went. He carried a camera with him a lot of the time too, the kind of teenager who liked capturing moments, taking pictures of his friends, of nights out, of nothing in particular. He wasn't a troubled kid, by most accounts. He wasn't a kid anyone was worried about. He was a normal 16-year-old, going to parties, hanging around with friends, figuring out who he was. His mother, Valerie, has spent almost 30 years now describing him not as a case number, but as her son, a boy who liked music too loud, a boy who should have grown up, gotten his first job, maybe moved off the island the way a lot of island kids do, maybe come home for Christmas every year with stories to tell. It's worth pausing on the island itself for a second, because geography matters more in this case than in almost any other we've covered. The Isle of Wight isn't a suburb of somewhere bigger. It's an actual island, physically cut off from mainland England by a stretch of water called the Solent, reachable only by ferry. In the mid-1990s, that meant a very specific kind of small-town claustrophobia. Everyone genuinely did know everyone, gossip traveled fast, and there was nowhere to disappear to. No easy train out of town, no anonymous city to vanish into. If Damien had simply run away that night, out of anger or teenage impulse, the assumption on an island that size was always that he'd turn up within days. Someone would spot him. Someone would hear something. That's what made the silence that followed so unnatural. On an island like this, silence isn't neutral. Silence means somebody is keeping a secret, and on an island where everyone knows everyone, that is a genuinely difficult thing to do for very long. That single fact, the geography of the place, is part of why this case has obsessed true crime communities for almost 3 decades. It isn't a sprawling city with 100 possible exits. It's a contained, walkable, fairy-locked community where the honest, uncomfortable implication is that someone on that island, or someone who was on that island that night, has always known more than they've said. None of that changes who Damien was before any of this happened, though. Friends who knew him described a kid who was, in a lot of ways, unremarkable in the best sense of the word. Not unremarkable as in forgettable, but unremarkable as in normal. He didn't have a criminal record. He wasn't known to police. A previous girlfriend, Abby Scott, would later say publicly that she believed there were parts of Damien's life he kept to himself, possibly involving drugs, though she was never entirely certain. But she was careful to frame this as ordinary teenage secrecy, the kind almost every 16-year-old keeps from the adults around them, not evidence of anything sinister. To understand why this case still divides an entire island, we need to walk through the last night anyone can account for him, hour by hour, sighting by sighting, because this is a case where almost everything we know comes down to fragments. A chip shop camera, a bus driver's memory, a stranger in a car park. Piece those fragments together, and you get one of the strangest, most disputed timelines in British missing persons history. It was Saturday, the 2nd of November, 1996. Cold, wet, the kind of grey British autumn night that blends into every other grey British autumn night. Except this one didn't end the way it should have. Damien had plans to go to a party in East Cowes with a friend, Chris Boone. His dad, Ed, gave the 2 boys a lift there. Nothing unusual. Nothing that, on its own, would make anyone's stomach turn 30 years later. 2 teenage boys, going to a house party, on a Saturday night, on a small island where everyone knew everyone. They stayed at the party for a while. Then, at some point in the evening, Damien and Chris left. Not to go home, but to go and buy some cider. Ordinary teenage stuff. But here's where the first strange detail enters the story. Witnesses at the party say Damien left carrying a black camera. That camera has never been found. Not at the scene, not with any of his belongings, not anywhere. It simply vanishes from the story, at the same moment Damien starts to. From there, the 2 boys made their way from East Cowes back across the water to West Cowes. The 2 halves of the town are separated by the River Medina, connected by a small chain ferry. And once they were back on the West Cowes side, they went looking for somewhere to keep the night going. They tried a fish and chip shop on the high street called Yorkie's. Damien went in, but for whatever reason, he left without ordering anything. Then they tried to get into a couple of pubs. It didn't work out. Whether it was because of their age, or because the pubs were full, the details are murky. What we do know is that this string of small failures, no chips, no pub, no plan, set the stage for what happened next. At Northwood Park, the 2 friends split up for the night. Chris headed home. Damien didn't. This is the moment the case turns from 2 teenagers on a Saturday night into something else entirely. Because from here forward, every single thing we know about Damien's movements comes from strangers. Fragments. People who happened to be in the right place at the wrong time, remembering a boy they didn't know, whose face would end up on a missing person poster years later. Damien went back to the high street. This time, he actually bought chips from Yorkie's. And it's here that the case gets its single most important piece of physical evidence. CCTV footage from inside and around the chip shop, time-stamped at roughly 11:45 p.m., showing Damien at the counter. In the footage, he's seen briefly interacting with a group of men near the counter before he leaves with his food. Who were those men? That question alone has fueled entire branches of theory and speculation for almost 30 years, and we'll come back to it. For now, just hold on to this. The last piece of hard video evidence anyone has of Damien Nettles alive shows him surrounded by people nobody has ever been able to fully identify or account for. Think about that for a second, because it's easy to let a detail like this slide past without really sitting in it. A 16-year-old boy, drunk or disoriented, alone in a chip shop just before midnight, and standing near him, close enough to be caught in the same frame, is a group of grown men whose identities have never been definitively established, nearly 30 years later. Not confirmed as suspects. Not confirmed as innocent bystanders. Just unknown. In a case with this few hard facts, that single unresolved detail does an enormous amount of psychological weight. It's the reason true crime communities have spent decades staring at grainy freeze frames from that footage, trying to make out faces, trying to count how many men are actually in frame, trying to work out whether one of them so much as glances toward the door when Damien walks out. After the chip shop, witnesses described Damien as behaving strangely. Several people who saw him that night said he looked as though he might be very drunk, stumbling, confused, not quite himself. One witness placed him around 11:15 p.m. near the Harbor Lights pub car park, allegedly trying to open the doors of a blue Ford Fiesta parked there. Not his car. Not a car anyone has ever definitively linked to him. Just a boy, apparently disoriented, trying door handles in a car park in the dark. Then there's the bus. A witness, the driver himself, recalled a boy matching Damien's description getting onto a bus near a supermarket stop, saying a few words, and then getting off again almost immediately. According to the account, Damien had tried to take the driver's photograph with the camera he was carrying and thanked him on the way out. And then there's the strangest account of the night. A third witness, sitting in their car, waiting to pick up a child from a different bus. They described seeing a figure matching Damien's description nearby, sitting close to himself, arms and legs pulled in tight, eating chips. According to this witness, the figure approached the car, looked in, and said 4 words, "They are watching us." Then, according to the witness, he wiped rain off the car window with his sleeve and walked away, back toward the high street. Nobody knows what he meant. Nobody knows who they were. It could have been nothing. A drunk, disoriented teenager saying something strange to a stranger in a car. It could have been paranoia. It could have been a joke. Or it could be the single most chilling 4 words in the entire case. A 16-year-old boy, alone, in the dark, telling a total stranger that someone was watching him, less than an hour before he vanished forever. After that, nothing confirmed. Just after midnight, the CCTV camera on the high street picked him up one more time, alone, walking, eating his chips, the same footage his mother would later identify as unmistakably her son. That footage is the last confirmed sighting of Damien Nettles that has ever been verified. He never came home. His parents realized something was wrong when the night stretched into morning and Damien still hadn't returned. And that's when this story stops being about one strange night out and starts being about one of the most badly mishandled missing persons investigations in recent British history. Here's a fact that every true crime investigator will tell you. The first 48 hours after someone goes missing are the most critical. Memories are freshest. CCTV hasn't been overwritten. Physical evidence hasn't degraded. Witnesses haven't had time to second-guess what they saw, or been talked out of it by other people's versions of events. In Damien's case, almost every single one of those 48 hours was squandered. The first failure came in how the case was even classified. Damien was 16 years old, a child, under UK law and under any common-sense definition. But when he was reported missing, he was initially logged not as a missing child, but as a missing adult. That single classification error meant the case didn't automatically receive the urgency, resourcing, or search protocols that a missing child case should have triggered. Requests for land and air searches in those early days were turned down. Then came the second failure, and this is the one that still makes investigators' jaws drop almost 30 years later. Remember that CCTV footage, the one showing Damien alone on the high street just after midnight, the one his own mother identified as the last confirmed sighting of her son? That footage was lost by police. Not damaged, not degraded, lost, along with additional footage from inside the chip shop that could have shown, in far greater clarity, exactly who those men near the counter were, and whether anyone followed Damien out into the night. It gets worse. The call log from the night Damien was reported missing, the record that would show exactly when his parents called police, what was said, and how quickly officers responded, no longer exists. The records showing which officers were even on duty that night have also been lost, which means that if you wanted to reconstruct, hour by hour, exactly how Hampshire police responded on the single most important night of this entire investigation, you couldn't. The paper trail simply isn't there. For a family desperate for answers, this wasn't just bureaucratic failure, it was devastating. Valerie Nettles has spent decades describing the sense of watching evidence, real, physical, irreplaceable evidence, slip through the cracks of an institution that was supposed to be looking for her son. In 2005, nearly a decade after Damien disappeared, she formally complained to the Independent Police Complaints Commission about the loss of that CCTV footage and the handling of the case more broadly. The response she got back essentially confirmed that action had already been taken regarding the officer responsible, which, if you think about it, is almost more damning than if nothing had happened at all. It meant the failure was known. It had already been acknowledged internally, and Damien was still gone. Community searches were organized. Volunteers combed areas around Cowes and Gurnard, but without the footage, without a clear timeline locked in from day one, without the urgency a missing child case should have generated immediately, the investigation was, in the words of people close to the case, on the back foot before it had even really begun. This is why Valerie Nettles has spent years campaigning for something now informally referred to as Damien's Law, a push to reform how UK police handle missing persons cases from the very first hour, so that no other family has to watch a case unravel the way hers did. Because here's the brutal truth this case forces you to sit with. We don't actually know what happened to Damien Nettles, but we know, with total certainty, that the people whose job it was to find out were handed a broken foundation to build from, and some of the cracks in that foundation were self-inflicted. And once the physical evidence started disappearing, what was left was something far messier and far more human. Rumor, whispers, an island where, allegedly, some people knew more than they were saying. Cowes has a public image, sailing regattas, yacht clubs, wealthy tourists in summer. It is, on the surface, one of the more affluent-looking corners of the Isle of Wight, but like a lot of small towns with a polished public face, people who actually lived there in the 1990s have described a very different undercurrent, a local drug scene that operated quietly beneath the postcard image, one that several people connected to this case believe Damien crossed paths with on the night he disappeared. Valerie Nettles herself has been unusually direct about this over the years. She has said publicly that in spite of the town's upscale reputation, there were people in Cowes involved in supplying drugs, and she has said, more than once, that she believes her son was killed over a cannabis debt, beaten to death by people connected to that scene. She has always rejected the more mundane theory that some in the community floated early on, that Damien simply fell into the sea that night, drunk and disoriented, and was swept away. She doesn't believe it. She never has. The most persistent, most talked about theory in this entire case centers on a local drug dealer named Nicky McNamara. Here's how that thread developed. In March 2002, nearly 6 years after Damien disappeared, Hampshire Constabulary's Major Crime Department took over the case and entered it onto Holmes, the UK's major incident computer system used for serious and complex investigations. Around this same period, an informant who had, back in the 1990s, been connected to McNamara's circle, came forward with an account of what he claimed had happened. According to that informant, Damien had gotten into an argument with McNamara over drugs. In the heat of that argument, McNamara allegedly struck Damien, a single punch that turned out to be fatal, whether McNamara intended to kill him or not. The informant's account went further. He claimed Damien's body was hidden for roughly 3 weeks inside a drug den, before eventually being buried somewhere in Cowes. In 2010, that same informant approached Valerie Nettles directly, saying he felt frustrated that nothing had been done with the information he'd given years earlier. Police did investigate. They carried out searches. Arrests were made. But ultimately, investigators concluded the informant's account couldn't be relied upon, and the trail went cold again. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn. Nicky McNamara died in 2002 of a heroin overdose. It was only after his death that rumors about his involvement in Damien's disappearance really began to circulate more widely, including persistent claims that McNamara made a deathbed confession, admitting some role in what happened to Damien. A deathbed confession is one of the most seductive pieces of true crime folklore there is. It feels like the kind of thing that has to be true, because why would someone lie with their last words? But it's also, forensically speaking, almost impossible to verify. There's no recording, no signed statement, just a rumor about a man who can never be questioned, in a case where physical evidence was already scarce and, in some cases, already gone. Was Nicky McNamara responsible for Damien Nettles' death? Investigators have never been able to prove it. He was never charged with anything connected to the case while he was alive. But the theory has outlived him by more than 2 decades, passed down through documentaries, podcasts, and pub conversations on an island where, allegedly, more people know more than they've ever told police. There's also a reason police were so quick to distrust the informant's account, and it's worth understanding, because it says a lot about how genuinely difficult this kind of case is to investigate. Informants embedded in drug scenes are, by definition, people already living inside a world of dishonesty, self-preservation, and shifting loyalties. Some come forward out of genuine conscience. Others come forward for a cut of a reward, or to settle a score with a rival, or simply because they've convinced themselves of a story after repeating it enough times. Investigators have to weigh all of that against the fact that this same informant's account contains specific, granular details, a 3-week concealment period, a specific burial location, the kind of specificity that can either indicate real inside knowledge or indicate a very convincing fabrication built from years of overheard rumor, without physical corroboration, without a body, without forensic evidence tying McNamara or anyone else to a specific location. Police were left in an impossible position, an account detailed enough to demand investigation, but not solid enough to support a charge. And that tension, a story detailed enough to feel true, but never quite provable, is the defining shape of almost every theory in this case. It's why, even now, you'll find people on the Isle of Wight who will tell you, with total confidence, exactly what they believe happened to Damien Nettles that night. Ask 5 different people, and you may well get 5 different answers, each one delivered with the same certainty. That's what 30 years of an unsolved case does to a small community. In the absence of an official answer, everyone builds their own. Which brings us to the arrests. Because in 2011, 15 years after Damien vanished, this case suddenly, briefly, looked like it might actually break open. For 15 years, the Damien Nettles case sat in that particular purgatory that so many cold cases fall into, never officially closed, but never actively moving either. Then, in May 2011, everything changed, at least for a while. Acting on new information, Hampshire Constabulary arrested 5 people on suspicion of murder: a 48-year-old man from Sandown, a person from Cowes aged 45, a person from Newport aged 50, a person from Ryde aged 37, and a person from Gravesend in Kent aged 40. All were released on bail while investigations continued. A 6th arrest, a 38-year-old man from East Cowes, followed in July. Then, in November 2011, police made what looked, at the time, like their most significant move yet. 2 more people were arrested, a 44-year-old man and a 35-year-old woman, both connected to an address on Marsh Road in Gurnard, the very village where Damien's own family lived. This wasn't just another arrest, it was an address. A physical location police believed was significant enough to search in detail. Forensic teams excavated the back garden, surveyed the grounds inside and out, and brought in cadaver dogs. For a family that had waited 15 years for police to treat this case with real urgency, this must have felt like the moment. A specific house, a specific patch of earth. Dogs trained to detect human remains, working a back garden in the quiet village of Gurnard. They found nothing. In May of that same year, specialist search teams had also used rafts to comb the water and reed beds at Dodnor Nature Reserve, near Newport, on the theory that Damien's body might have ended up there. That search, too, came back empty. By early 2012, 3 of those originally arrested, the 38-year-old man from Ryde, a 36-year-old woman from Cowes, and a 45-year-old man from Cowes, were still on police bail, rebailed multiple times as investigators tried to build a case. The other 4 men arrested in 2011 were eventually released with no further action. And then, over time, the remaining 3 were released as well. Nobody was ever charged. In 2013, Hampshire Constabulary tried one more lever, a £20,000 reward for information leading to a conviction, offered for a 6-month window. It generated roughly 30 separate accounts of information from the public. None of it moved the case forward. When the window closed, despite pleas from Damien's family, police declined to extend the reward. Think about what that timeline actually represents. 8 people arrested across a single investigation, a specific address searched, excavated, and combed with cadaver dogs. 2 separate large-scale physical searches, one in a nature reserve, one in a residential garden, a 5-figure reward, 30 new tips, and at the end of all of it, not one single charge, not one confirmed answer about where Damien Nettles is. That's not a small, quiet, cold case that nobody looked into. That's a case that was actively, aggressively pursued by police at multiple points over multiple decades, and it still produced nothing that could stand up in court. Which tells you something important about this case. This isn't a story about a lack of effort. In many ways, it's a story about how thoroughly a trail can go cold, even when people are trying, genuinely, to warm it back up. By the mid-2010s, with the official investigation largely stalled again, it was 2 journalists, not police officers, who picked up where Hampshire Constabulary had left off. In July 2016, almost 20 years after Damien disappeared, BBC 3 released a documentary series unlike anything British true crime had produced before. It was called Unsolved, The Boy Who Disappeared, and it was fronted by 2 investigative journalists, Alice Hart and Bronagh Munro, both of whom had previously worked on the BBC's flagship current affairs program, Panorama. What made the series unusual wasn't just the case itself, it was the format. Rather than conducting their investigation privately and then presenting viewers with a polished, finished conclusion, Hart and Munro let cameras follow them as the investigation actually happened. Viewers watched them track down anonymous sources, sit across from people rumored to be involved, dig through old case files, and follow leads that sometimes went nowhere, and sometimes got genuinely uncomfortable. Released as 8 15-minute episodes, all at once, on the BBC's iPlayer streaming service, it was explicitly compared at the time to shows like Making a Murderer and the podcast Serial, a British attempt at that same slow-burn, journalist-as-detective format. Over the course of the series, Hart and Munro tracked down a former informant connected to the island's drug-dealing scene from the 1990s. They spoke with Damien's younger brother, James, who returned to the Isle of Wight after 12 years away, specifically to help with the investigation. Damien's mother, Valerie, came back to the island as well, walking the journalists through her own memories and her own theories. The series dug specifically into the CCTV footage controversy, cross-examining witness accounts that had shifted or contradicted each other over the years, including testimony from a witness who came to be nicknamed, within the investigation, the Weatherman. What the documentary didn't do, and this matters, is solve the case. It didn't name a killer, it didn't produce a body. What it did do was put the failures of the original investigation and the lingering, unresolved rumors about the island's drug scene in front of a national audience for the first time in 2 decades. Valerie Nettles later said the experience was, in her words, bittersweet, painful to relive, but ultimately valuable, because it forced new questions into the open, even where it couldn't deliver new answers. The renewed attention did produce one more thing: public pressure. A petition circulated calling for the case to be raised in the UK Parliament, pushing for dedicated funding for Hampshire Police to properly resource a fresh cold case review. Members of the public organized marches, campaigning specifically for police to search Parkhurst Forest and areas around Gurnard, based on claims, again, from informants whose reliability police disputed, that Damien's remains might be buried there. Police declined those specific search requests, citing concerns about the credibility of the sources. And that refusal led to one of the most quietly devastating details in this entire case. When police wouldn't authorize a dig at the Parkhurst Forest site, Damien's family and a small team of friends decided to do it themselves. With no professional forensic support, no specialist equipment, and no institutional backing, just shovels, time, and desperation, they began digging, by hand, in a wooded copse where a paid informant had claimed Damien's remains were likely buried. They returned again and again, working for hours at a time, in difficult terrain, in every kind of weather the Isle of Wight could throw at them. Sit with that image for a second. A missing boy's mother and his friends, decades after he disappeared, on their knees in a British forest, digging through mud and roots by hand, because the institutions responsible for finding him wouldn't. They didn't find him there, but they kept looking anyway, because for Valerie Nettles, the alternative, simply stopping, was never really an option. Before we get to Valerie's story, we need to talk about one more thread the documentary pulled on, because it exposes something that runs underneath this entire case: the sheer unreliability of eyewitness memory, even from people who mean well and believe they're telling the truth. One witness from that night became known within the investigation, somewhat informally, by the nickname the Weatherman, a man whose account of seeing Damien placed him in a specific location at a specific time. His statement mattered enormously, because in a case built almost entirely on scattered eyewitness sightings rather than hard forensic evidence, every single timestamp either supports or contradicts every other timestamp. If the Weatherman's account was accurate, it helped build one version of Damien's final movements. If it wasn't, if his memory had shifted over the years, or been influenced by media coverage, or simply been wrong from the start, it could send investigators chasing the wrong minute of the wrong hour entirely. When Hart and Monroe sat down to re-examine his account for the documentary, they didn't take it at face value. They pushed. They cross-referenced it against other statements. And what they found is something that shows up in almost every cold case that relies this heavily on human memory. Small inconsistencies, details that shifted slightly with each retelling, timelines that didn't quite line up with the physical geography of the town. This isn't a story about a witness lying. It's a story about what almost 30 years, dozens of retellings, and the psychological weight of being connected to a missing child's final hours can do to a person's memory. Human memory isn't a recording. It's a reconstruction, rebuilt every time you access it, and vulnerable to being subtly reshaped by everything that happens afterward. New information, other people's accounts, media coverage, even the simple passage of time. In a case with almost no surviving CCTV, no forensic evidence, and no body, testimony like the Weatherman's isn't just important. It's nearly the entire foundation the investigation has had to build on. And foundations built on memory alone are, by their nature, unstable. It's one more reason this case has resisted resolution for so long. It isn't only that evidence was lost. It's that so much of what remains was never hard evidence to begin with. It was memory, retold across decades, filtered through grief, suspicion, and the slow erosion that happens to every human recollection over enough time. At the center of this case, for almost 30 years now, has been one person who has refused to let it fade: Valerie Nettles. At some point after Damien disappeared, the family relocated. Valerie now lives in Texas, in the United States. A detail that in itself says something about how a single unresolved tragedy can scatter a family across an ocean. But distance never translated into distance from the case. If anything, it seems to have sharpened her resolve. In 2019, Valerie published a book, The Boy Who Disappeared, laying out the full, often maddening story of her son's case, in her own words. Not as a detective, not as a journalist, but as a mother who has spent decades trying to reconstruct, piece by piece, the last hours of her son's life, from fragments other people were willing to hand her. She has marked every anniversary publicly. On the 22nd anniversary, in 2018, she was still pushing for reform, to missing persons policing through the informal campaign known as Damien's Law. On the 25th anniversary, in 2021, coverage of the case noted that his own sister still carried the specific, private guilt of having sent her brother home that night, the kind of, if only, that never fully leaves a family in a case like this. By the case's 28th anniversary in 2024, local Isle of Wight press was still running fresh coverage, still asking the same question that has never been answered: What Happened to Damien Nettles? That same year, 2024, Valerie's story was referenced alongside coverage of other recent, high-profile British missing persons cases, the disappearance of Jack O'Sullivan and the death of Jay Slater, in a piece exploring what happens to families after the media spotlight moves on, after the searches stop making headlines, after the world simply loses interest while the family never can. Through it all, Valerie's message has stayed remarkably consistent. She isn't looking for sympathy, she's looking for information. She has repeatedly and publicly urged anyone with knowledge of what happened to Damien to come forward, even now, even decades later, even if it feels too late to matter. Because in cases like this, it's rarely too late. Memories fade, but so do loyalties. People who were too frightened, too young, or too complicit to speak in 1996 are not the same people they are today. Relationships end, consciences catch up, cold cases get solved, sometimes simply because someone finally decides that 30 years of silence is 30 years too many. Hampshire Constabulary maintains a dedicated cold case team, and the official position remains that the case is still open, that any new, credible information will be investigated. The Crime Stoppers hotline still takes anonymous tips on Damien's case to this day. Organizations like the UK charity Missing People still list him, still keep his case active on their website, with the same quiet, aching message displayed to anyone who looks him up, that they're there for him, whenever he's ready. The standard, heartbreaking language used for a case that has never been officially reclassified from missing to anything else, because there has never been a body to reclassify it around. So where does that leave us? Almost 30 years on, Damien Nettles has never been found. Not his body, not his belongings, not the black camera he was carrying that night, the one that vanished from the story at almost the exact moment he did. No one has ever been charged with anything connected to his disappearance, despite 8 arrests across more than a decade of investigation. The CCTV footage that could have shown, in detail, exactly who those men near the chip shop counter were, the footage that showed Damien's final confirmed movements alive, was lost by the very police force investigating his case, and has never been recovered. What's left is a landscape of theories, none of them proven, several of them contradictory. The theory that he fell into the sea that night, drunk and disoriented, and was carried away. A theory his own mother has always firmly rejected. The theory involving a cannabis debt and a fatal confrontation with a local drug dealer. A theory that gained enormous traction after that dealer's death, and the persistent, unverifiable rumor of a deathbed confession. The strange, unexplained detail of a teenage boy telling a total stranger, less than an hour before he vanished, that they are watching us. The men in the chip shop, never fully identified, never fully cleared, and underneath all of it, the uncomfortable truth that makes this case genuinely different from a lot of the missing persons stories you'll see covered on this channel. This isn't primarily a story about a killer who was clever enough to evade justice. It's just as much a story about how badly a justice system can fail a family in the very first hours when it matters most. Misclassifying a missing child as a missing adult, losing the single most important piece of video evidence in the entire case, losing the call logs, losing the duty rosters, refusing early search requests that might have made all the difference. Cowes is still a small, quiet town. People still walk down that same high street every day, past the site where Yorkie's chip shop once stood. Most of them, with no idea that the last confirmed footage of a missing teenager was ever recorded there. Life on the Isle of Wight moved on the way life always does. But for one family, it never really did. Not fully, not completely, because you cannot properly grieve someone you've never been allowed to bury. It's also worth saying plainly why a case like this deserves more attention than it's gotten. Most true crime content gravitates toward cases with a dramatic ending. A trial, a verdict, a killer's face on the news. Damien Nettles has none of that. And maybe that's exactly why so many channels have skipped over it. There's no courtroom footage to show you, no perp walk, no neat 3-act structure with a resolution at the end. What there is instead is something arguably more important. A case study in exactly how a missing persons investigation can fail in its first critical hours and exactly what that failure costs a family for the rest of their lives. Every procedural safeguard that exists today in UK missing persons policy, faster initial response for missing children, stricter evidence handling protocols, better interagency record keeping, exists in part because cases like Damien's exposed how badly things could go wrong when those safeguards weren't there. That doesn't bring Damien home, but it's the closest thing to a legacy this case has produced, and it's worth sitting with. Damien Nettles would be 46 years old today. Somewhere out there, in a version of this story that never happened, he grew up. He probably still loved that music. He probably still carried a camera around, still took pictures nobody else thought to take. He probably came home to Grenard for the holidays, sat around a table with his mother and his sister and his brother, and none of them ever had to learn what it feels like to search a forest by hand for someone they love. That's not the story we got. What we got instead is a 16-year-old boy who walked out of a chip shop with a bag of chips in his hands, and a mother who has spent almost 30 years refusing to stop asking what happened next. If you know anything at all, about what happened to Damien Nettles on the night of the 2nd of November, 1996, you can contact Hampshire Constabulary directly on 101 and ask for the cold case team, or you can share information anonymously through Crime Stoppers on 0800 555 111. It doesn't matter how small the detail feels. It doesn't matter how long ago it happened. Somebody out there still knows something, and somebody out there is still waiting to hear it. I want to ask you something before you go, and I actually want you to answer it in the comments. Knowing what you now know about how those first 48 hours were handled, the lost tape, the missing call logs, the missing child case that got filed as a missing adult, do you think Damien Nettles could have been found if the investigation had gotten those first 2 days right? Let me know what you think down below, because I read every single one of them. And if this case pulled you in the way it pulled us in when we first started researching it, do yourself a favor and subscribe. Hit that bell, because we've got another deeply researched unsolved case coming very soon, and you are not going to want to miss it. This has been AMC True Crime. Damien, wherever you are, we haven't forgotten you.